Good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending Game of Loans, which will hopefully be less exciting than last night's show, which I never say about a panel normally, but after watching that last night, I need some less excitement. Anyway, I want to thank everybody for being here, and I want to thank my panelists for coming. So I am going to let them introduce themselves quickly, and then we are going to show a quick video so that you don't have to hear us just outline the basics of the student loan crisis, of the $1.5 trillion in outstanding debt. No small amount of it people don't seem to be able to pay off. So we're going to show the video, but first, everybody just do a quick intro of yourself and like a one-sentence bio.
Scott Pulsfer, I'm the president of Western Governors University. I've been with them for 3 years. Prior to higher education, though, I spent 20 years in industry and mostly technology and software startups.
I'm Tracy Palangian. I started Social Finance, which is a nonprofit impact investing firm, back in 2011. And we work at the intersection of policy, finance, and how to do social change. And we've pioneered the social impact bond. And then today, hopefully, I'll talk about the career impact bond, which is a particular flavor of the income share agreement.
Hi, everybody. David Klein, CEO, co-founder of Common Bond. At Common Bond, if you have a student loan, we help. And we do that in 3 different ways. 1, provide low-cost loan for students going to school. 2, provide lower-cost refinancing opportunities for those who've graduated. And 3, we provide a suite of student loan benefits to employers who can provide those benefits to their employees to pay down debt faster.
I'm Tonio DeSorrento, co-founder and CEO at Vemo Education, where we help colleges design successful income share agreement programs. Started my career in the Marine Corps Artillery, was a lawyer for a little bit, and most recently was an early employee at SoFi before starting Vemo Education.
My name is David Cooper. I'm the Chief Investment Officer for the Purdue Research Foundation, where we manage assets on behalf of both the Research Foundation and Purdue University. I've also been very fortunate to be a part of the back-a-boiler income share agreement team at Purdue.
Okay, great. And I should apologize for one thing. I left my watch back in New York, so I'm not maniacally checking emails and texts. I am keeping some track of the time here. Anyway, if you could roll the video so we could get started, and then we can get started with questions.
College in America. It's 4 years of all-nighters, cake stands, ethnically diverse welcome brochures, Pinterest-perfect dorm rooms, and crushing student debt.
I have $69,812.
$47,000.
$90,000.
$35,000.
$350,000.
My minimum student loan payment is $1,000 a month. You have about 10 years to pay that.
I will be roughly 36.
45 years old.
Do you guys just want to run it without the video? We could just hear the sound?
Drowning in debt. In fact, in the past 20 years.
All right.
College in America. It's 4 years of all-nighters, cake stands, ethnically diverse welcome brochures, Pinterest-perfect dorm rooms, and crushing student debt.
I have $69,812.
$47,000.
$90,000.
$35,000.
$350,000.
$60,000 worth of student loans.
My minimum student loan payment is $1,000 a month.
It should take me about 10 years to pay that back.
I will be roughly 36.
45 years old.
I don't know how old I'll be when I pay that off.
College graduates are drowning in debt. In fact, in the past 20 years, the average student debt has more than tripled and now tops $30,000.
The number of Americans age 60 and older with student loan debt quadrupled between 2005 and 2015 to nearly 3 million.
In 2006, total student debt was under $500 billion. Now it's over $1.5 trillion, eclipsing both credit card debt and auto loan debt. Yeah.
In the year 2016, the number of defaults on student loan repayments increased by 14% over the previous year.
We have a crisis around student aid, around student debt, and it really is impacting not only students, but it's going to ultimately impact our economy.
To no longer view millennials as just
whining kids. We're adults, we're professionals, and we're working really hard to get where our parents were and to do better than our parents. Because that's supposed to be the dream, right?
Okay, and one other thing I should say before I plunge in here. We have a lot of people working in the business of student loans on this panel. What we don't have are any activists in the field, and at the moment, as we all know, this has become quite a political issue too. So as moderator, I actually have to play a double role and push back on that as well. So I just want that out there. So on that note, we just heard all that, right? Who wants to defend student loans on this panel? Who wants to start?
Well, let me say the following. So at Common Bond, we exist because I was a student going back to business school and needed to pay my way 100% with student loans. And when I went through that experience, I went through the personal pain of three things in particular. One, interest rates were unnecessarily high. Two, the process was overly complex. It was opaque. And three, the customer service from incumbents was pretty poor. And so I went back to business school with the express purpose of wanting to start a company before graduating and doing something with a really strong social mission. And so after having gone through that personal pain, having a background at finance from McKinsey and American Express and having the entrepreneurial ambitions coming from a family of entrepreneurs, I thought, this is kind of the perfect storm. This is what I'm going to dedicate myself to solving. And the mission became how to lower the cost of higher education in the US. And it just so happened that we were going to focus on the financing piece of the rising cost of education. There's also the first order derivative of the issue, which is the rising cost of tuition. We're just focused on the specific cost of financing. I don't think anybody out there defends the notion of student loans. I think what we need to understand, and frankly, I think what we all agree with, whether Elizabeth Warren was sitting right next to me or us on the stage, we would agree to one thing. Nobody in this country should unknowingly take on debt that their life will not allow them to pay back. Period. End of story. Everything we do, everything we build from a for-profit perspective, a public perspective, a public-private perspective, should be based on that notion. Certainly at our company it is, and I think a lot of the potential solutions out there that are both practical and possible to pass need to keep that at the core of what we're trying to do.
Okay, so a question for David Cooper. How do students get into debt they don't understand? How does this happen?
I'm the investment person, so I'm probably not the best person to take on that question. You want to?
Tracy, do you want to try it? Anybody?
Well, I was gonna volunteer Tonio.
Oh, Tonio.
He's
Okay.
the guy who interfaces with the students.
Okay, Tonio, you go for it.
How do income share agreements work?
No. How do people get in over
Can I
their
answer
heads?
that?
How do people get in over their head?
Okay, you go for it.
We enroll 115,000 students, so we actually disperse quite a bit of federal aid.
Right.
I will tell you, I think that individuals get into debt because they don't actually understand what they're doing. And I'll give a perspective on that. Just about 5 years ago, for example, we introduced the Responsible Borrowing Initiative. It had a very specific purpose to increase the information available to students to understand what they were undertaking to fund their education with WGU. Mind you, this is at an institution that is about a quarter of the cost of a typical bachelor's degree. But even our students at the time, 5 years ago, they were graduating with over $21,000 of debt per graduate who took debt. But we realized we could give them better information about taking on the cost of their education with WGU. And that had to do with cost of attendance, it had to do with the total cost of the loans that they were undertaking, et cetera. And when you can present that really clearly, guess what? You actually can reduce their borrowing to fund their debt. In 1 year, we reduced annual borrowing per student by 40%, such that our now debt per graduate is only $15,000, and it's still declining. We expect it to decline to about $12,500. And that is in contrast to the industry as a whole, where it's just going up and up and up. There is one other big issue, which is there is no check against the rising cost of attendance generally in the higher ed system. It is, for the last 2 decades, it's the cost of attending and in pursuing a bachelor's degree has risen at twice the rate of inflation. When the money flows, there's no one really saying, well, I don't have to reduce the costs. We've focused specifically on reducing costs, but From the individual standpoint, I don't think they understand what they're getting into. I don't think they understand the terms of the loans that they don't understand the cost or the total cost of actually paying for it. What should they take it all out, et cetera. And so our initiative was very specifically to really lay out for them and provide them better information so they make better choices.
Why don't you think, Tracy, or do you, David? Why do you think? Why do you think schools don't do this more often?
They don't have an incentive to. I don't think they have an incentive to.
Okay. Anybody else?
Because right now the incentive is when a student borrows to go to school, the incentive is actually for the student to make sure that he or she actually gets the outcomes to repay the debt. And the colleges have no incentive. In fact, they bear none of the risk of failure because they're not caught holding the bag. And what I think is really important before we get into the income share agreement, which is clearly gaining a lot of momentum, is actually take a step back and ask the fundamental question. Why are students taking on the debt? They're taking on the debt because they want to go to college. Why are they going to college? And it's because that we have created this narrative, especially over the last several decades, that college is the engine for economic mobility, that college is a ticket for a better life. And I think that the data doesn't say that. I think there's plenty of evidence that talks about the rate of college completions over time of different quartiles of our society. And the people at the bottom quartile is just not having any gains at all. And this idea that college is going to solve the economic mobility, it needs to be seriously interrogated. Also, the whole idea that college is so the Gallup poll, I think everyone's familiar with this. Like if you ask most people why they're going to college, the main reason is because you want to get a good job, right? And that kind of connection of going to college and getting a good job, and we're going to talk about transparency of outcomes. I think we're all committed to doing that. But if you think about our own college experience, when we went to college, it's completely the output model. It doesn't matter, how hard you work, how bright you are. It's 4 years, 32 courses, and you graduate. And it doesn't mean that output process, that journey, could actually yield an outcome. So if you were to take a step back and think about if the ultimate goal that we want to see for society, especially for the lower quartile of our population, is to get a good job, achieve economic
Can I ask a question? What do you mean by the lower quartile of the population?
These are low-income people who've been shut out of economic mobility, shut out of opportunity to lift themselves. This phrase that talent is everywhere, but opportunity isn't, is precisely that group of people who have been experiencing stagnating wages for decades.
So are you arguing they shouldn't go to college at all?
So I actually would like to go there, and I know it's very provocative, but this is like a deeply held American narrative that college is good for you. And it's actually not true in other parts of the world. And if the goal is to get a job, achieve economic well-being for yourself and for your family, and actually fulfill your own potential, there are actually many ways to get there. In fact, 54% of the American labor force, 54% of jobs are middle skills jobs, which are defined as you need a high school degree, but not a college degree, but you just need some skilling, credentialing, green jobs, the building trades, coding, healthcare.
But do you think, I don't mean to cut you off, but do you think this then risks creating a permanent underclass, right? I mean, if we have we're trying to combat stagnation here. And I don't mean this to take over the panel for a second, but at the same time, you're basically saying this group should be shut out of college.
No.
Okay.
Can I just...
We're not saying that.
Okay.
Can I just offer, I think there's a lot to unpack in what Tracy shared, but just to be careful, the aggregate data still proves that, in fact, if you complete college and attain the credential, your potential for lifetime earnings is 65% higher than associates, let alone even a high school diploma. The issue I think Tracy's raising in the bottom income quartile of households, the attainment rate over the last 50 years has only gone from like 7% to 11% in the bottom income quartile of households. Whereas in the top income quartile of households, that attainment rate has gone from about 50% to now north of 70%. So the issue isn't about whether college is worth it, because to be clear, if you attain the credential of college, that absolutely is the surest path to opportunity. I think, Tracy, you also highlight another key thing is we have to be careful that credential is not just a bachelor's degree in the future. it can actually be multiple variations of credentials. There's a lot of it's even captured in the video, and the voiceover there is this idea of like a 4-year degree. How do most of you know that it doesn't actually take 4 years for most people to complete a 4-year degree? It's over 5 years is the average time to complete right now. That is so set into our psyche around what college is supposed to be, and that's not actually the best path to opportunity for so many. So the issue still is among the bottom income quartile, let alone for the masses as it relates to the loan problem, is that you have to complete if you want to return on the investment so that you can pay back the loans. The vast majority of the loans are in default or forbearance, et cetera, from students who've actually stopped out.
Right.
Those students have to complete if we're going to get a return on the loans that they took on.
Did you want to say something?
Just want to add, pulling a few things together, going back to your first question, there are 3 pieces of data that if every single person going to college was able to receive, would start making better decisions. And a lot of the stuff that's being talked about right now would almost solve itself in a data-driven, market-driven way. Those 3 pieces of information are: 1, what's the cost of me going to this particular college or university? 2, if I need a loan, what is my monthly payment going to be when I graduate? 3, based on data from this college and university and specifically their program or major, how much am I likely to make on an annual and monthly basis when I graduate? If we give those 3 pieces of information to every single person before they go to college, they will be armed with the information they need to make the decision that is right for them. And I think what we avoid is in part what we're getting today, which is driving some of the issue around delinquency and defaults with student loans. And that is we're not giving information to folks. We're telling them to go to school. They go to school without realizing they take on a significant amount of student debt, and the outcomes that education allows them to get in the job market does not match the cost of the debt that they take on. And so you have a series, if you play this out years and years into the future, what you're likely going to have are a number of schools that need to play by market rules. They need to serve their consumer, the student, well. And you might even have a flushing out of some colleges and universities inside of this country. And it might not be a bad thing, to the point earlier mentioned, if what we're trying to solve is that key question in the beginning, which is no one in this room, no one outside this room believes that in this country we should unknowingly indebt individuals beyond what their life will allow them to pay back.
Okay. How would you do that? And then I'm going to jump to this side because I feel like this side's getting top heavy over here. But I want to just follow up with that for 1 second.
I think there are a few ways to approach this. 1, I think the federal government has a role. 2, I think private sector has a role. And 3, I think individuals taking on the debt have a role. If, not a lot of time here, but if we methodically work through those 3 constituencies, is there something the federal government could do, and this is a conversation in DC right now, that actually does some kind of institutional risk share where an institution or a college or university has some skin in the game to make sure that as they graduate students, that employment rate 3 months after graduation is really high, so the loans from that school are getting paid back. And if they're not being paid back at a certain rate, you might lose some of the federal funding benefits that you currently have. That's 1. 2, from an employer's perspective, there's actually legislation on the Hill right now, bipartisan, co-sponsored by Republicans and Democrats, that would enable, in a tax-free way, an employer to contribute, say $100 a month to the employee's student loan, to pay down that student loan faster, to save them a lot of money, and actually be a form of credit enhancement for the federal government and reduce the amount of delinquency and default that the federal government has. Thirdly, finally, the consumer. I do think everybody has a responsibility. The consumer, the lender, the federal government, the company. It's incumbent upon the consumer to understand what those 3 pieces of information are. Now, we can make it a whole heck of a lot easier to find out those 3 pieces of information. 1, what's the cost going to be? 2, if I need loans, what's my monthly payment going to be post? And 3, if I go to that program at that school, how much am I going to make on a monthly basis and can I afford it? You do that, I think we solve a lot.
Okay. I would just add that given the history of how credit cards work, short of legislation, you're not going to see that happen across the board, the information being given. I mean, the credit card industries did not do it till we legislated it.
And that might be a possibility. You know, there are certain responsible lenders out there, I know one very well, that provides this information to the user, not because we're told, because it's right. And so if we need to legislate right, I'm all for it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I could take you to this side of the room for if I could.
Yeah, no, yes. I'm trying to get over here. Go.
Look, we say people get in over their head,
right,
and we want to know what to do about it. And when we talk about this, we seem to be focused on a student and a lender and the terms. And the entities, the class of organizations we're looking at to get people to better outcomes, and where all this money is going into schools. And so you need a third party. And I think, you know, we don't have a Mercedes loan crisis because the Mercedes is always worth a loan. You have a student loan crisis because people aren't always getting value. And not even just the loan value. College is effectively free for millions of people with veterans benefits or Pell Grants or in college, states with free community college. And those people in those classes who are getting free college are making the worst choices about which ones to attend. So I think what's missing is a focus on schools as a solution actually to the root here. Two leaders in this represented on the panel in Purdue and Western Governors, and then arming schools who are doing the right thing to stand out so that people who have, whether it's a student loan benefit from the government or a veterans benefit like the GI Bill, something they can take to make good decisions, like David said, which takes us to...
Right. I would point to the fact, though, I mean, there was an article that came out last week, and I'm not going to remember where it was, that looked at the FAFSA process for lower-income kids and basically found it all, but they could not navigate it. These kids literally could not navigate it. They didn't have the documents available. They didn't have the help. The school guidance counselors were completely overwhelmed. And the result was that they either didn't go to college or they ended up, in expensive for-profit, colleges where they were taking on way too many loans. I mean, so again, it comes back to this issue of how do you actually get to the point of getting people to this help. But before I go there, I wanted to ask you about Purdue and how they kept tuition down, because this is such an important part of the discussion here. You have one school that really made a commitment and did something.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Thank you. So President Mitch Daniels, who was our governor of the state of Indiana, became president of Purdue about 7 years ago. And he took on the challenge of that it wasn't just a law of nature that tuition had to go up 3%, 5%, 7% a year. And he said, let's take a time out for 1 year and let's just hold the line and see what happens. So his premise was, let's work our way more toward the student's budget as opposed to pulling the student along to our budget. And with that came a lot of different initiatives when they looked at it from that lens to really keep costs down. And that included a partnership with Amazon for textbooks. They've done a lot with automation and vendor management. We now have a liberal arts degree in 3 years. So Back a Boiler, which I think we'll probably get to as a part of that, the ISA affordability initiative. So I think they took that challenge head on, and we're going on 8 years now of no tuition increases. It's actually cheaper to go to Purdue today in nominal terms than it was in 2012.
And are you hearing is Purdue hearing from dozens and dozens of colleges about how to emulate this?
So Mitch could probably answer that better than I, but I think it's obviously hitting the radar, and folks are paying attention for sure.
I would bet they're not. So I don't think I don't think there's an incentive to actually lower tuition. I think that you have Governor Daniels or President Daniels is amazing, but I think that is something that you have to actually focus on. That fundamentally you have to solve for the cost side of the equation, not just the funding and affordability side of that. And I would just make this analogy is that because someone brought up autos and Mercedes, 50 years ago now probably was when leasing started to make its way into auto purchasing. And the vast majority of cars sold today in the U.S. are actually through leases, and you don't actually own the underlying asset, and you basically rent that asset. I worry that there are a lot of very smart financiers who are trying to figure out basically how does someone pay for an $80,000 cost. That's roughly the average cost of acquiring your bachelor's degree. That is going up at 6% a year. That's better than real estate over the same time period, by the way. They're looking at it going like, that's a really good investment. How do I make money flow to those individuals who have to acquire that kind of asset? So there's not a lot of incentive to keep the costs under control. And to the kind of back of Boiler, the 3-year liberal arts degrees, there's two sides of that in education too, which is what is the cost per year and how long does it take you to complete it? At WGU, again, our students' median time to complete a bachelor's degree is 2.5 years. And we also have a fixed tuition per 6-month term, so it's $32.50 per term. You're completing a bachelor's in about $16,000 of total cost. No one's thinking that way, especially that 5th year. Students are going like, that's a really, really, really expensive year because you forego earnings while also continue to pay $25,000 a year to, and that's all in, by the way. That's tuition plus living, everything else. Like, that's really expensive. You have to actually have institutional accountability around those outcomes, and one of them has to be the cost. David makes exactly the right point. There are going to be many opportunities that does not actually support an $80,000 investment for anyone. And so what are those alternative investments you can make? And you can definitely see alternative providers, coding boot camps, sub-degree credentials. Yep. A lot of those are becoming a lot less expensive, and there are also pathways to the same earnings outcomes if you go get a degree. Well, there's disruption happening on multiple different sides. Where it's not happening is on the cost side of it yet. And so we have to figure out how to do it.
And Tracy, you've done some work in that area. So do you want to discuss that for a second?
Sure, I'll start, and then Tonio, who's our partner in one of our income share agreement, can talk about it. So you mentioned that we got to have different risk sharing arrangement, and how does the employee get into the picture? Someone needs to get a job for the employer to be part of the risk share. And I think that the income share agreement, which has been around for several decades now, clearly a failed experiment at Yale back in the 70s, but I think the model has been refined over time, is a lot more sophisticated. The risks are being isolated better and apportioned to the right people to take that on. But essentially, an income share agreement works like this. Instead of taking on a loan, you allow an individual to go through college or coding school or other credentialing program, maybe a technical college, with no upfront cost to the person. The obligation then is that the person promises to repay a portion of their gross wages over a fixed period of time. Now, the typical levers for an income share agreement are the percent share of your income, the length of the obligation, the number of years, whether there exists a threshold, an income threshold. Only if you make over $40,000, $50,000 does this obligation kick in, so that threshold, and not all ISAs have that threshold, as well as the cap, which is what is the maximum amount that you could end up paying, and
okay.
David, you can talk about the back-end boiler and the terms out there. But there are many ways. What I wanted to conclude, Helaine, is that there are many ways to think about the income share agreement, both in terms of these levers, the terms that I mentioned, as well as the population that you're targeting, as well as the program that you apply it to. And it's not like a monolithic thing, the ISA. And when we get to talk a little bit about our approach at Social Finance, which is very much focused on the needs and the opportunities for that bottom quartile of low-income folks, we've been thinking very hard about student protections and the needs of the student to persist and actually complete these programs, and how to price all of that into the ISA.
Okay, so a question then, because how then does that combat tuition inflation, though? Because the terms can change. I mean, not for a particular student, but they could for the future students, right? You could take a different percentage, you could take different years, you can, make the threshold higher or lower. So that doesn't, am I missing something? But that doesn't seem like it would combat inflation at all.
I'll talk about that. I think what we're seeing today is the schools opting into doing income share agreements. And we have across code schools and colleges, 40-something now, working with Vemo Education, are ones who are already proactively addressing things like cost and value. So this is how they're signaling it. You're not going to see a school that has no interest in signaling value or managing its costs opt into this. On the other hand, some are being competitively forced to do it. Like in the code school space, you can't have a code school anymore without income share agreements. The idea won. And what that means then is people are forced to confront this percent of earnings thing. A loan payment's always a percent of your earnings also. But we are often in denial about that. And I think a lot of not Vemo client universities are maybe in denial about what's going to happen to their graduates and whether they can afford this. I think that, Helaine, it's not instant, but over time, people will be confronted with what can actually be taken here. It's like you can only have so much percent of GDP go to one thing. And I think education's eating a lot of it, and maybe people are in denial about what it means for their graduates. This makes it very transparent. And if not for a particular school, then for its peer schools who opt into doing this.
Do you give them to everybody, or do you give it to select students? I mean, because when you adopt this on a mass scale, it seems like you're going to run into some of the problems that the student loan sector has run into. People will default, they will do different things with their lives, things won't work out. How do you see this playing out?
Well, it plays out, every one of our clients is doing something that's going to strategically complement their own student success initiatives and their own affordability initiatives. So they're a little different school to school. But in general, our school customers want to use this for any student who has financial need. And their goal is partially discovery. We don't know what happened. I mean, nobody has granular outcomes on their graduates. A few public institutions in really well-functioning states do. Purdue actually had that before they met us. Most of our customers, private nonprofit colleges somewhere, they don't know what happens to their graduates. And the first thing they're doing is taking inventory. And they're going to learn from that. I think, again, the feedback here is that people can see what it really will cost before they do any course of study. And the school has to manage that. Today, you charge the same sticker price at most colleges regardless of the course of study, even though some have labs and expensive faculty and higher earnings and some have lower. And so you have this cross-subsidization. And maybe there's public policy reasons we do that. But if it's accidental or if it's not a deliberate value choice, we're surfacing those things for them.
Yeah, and Helaine, I think the market signaling that ISAs are going to give to institutions and universities will help that tuition cost. Because again...
How? I'm still not quite getting it.
So what you're saying, when we put forth an ISA program, back boiler, what you're saying is, and we feel like we appropriately price it, is that we believe the value you receive for your education at Purdue is worth it, so much so we'll put our own money behind it. Because we're that confident we're going to get it back, and we're going to get a return on that income share agreement. If you don't believe that, if as an institution you don't believe that, or you don't have that confidence, you're probably not going to be as willing to put that forth. And I think the data that you receive back will really drive decisions about the return on cost at universities.
How many years, if somebody wants to ask me about this, how many years is somebody committing to right now? What is the general range of paying back, and at what percent of their income? And how does that compare to typical student loans?
So it differs for us in the Back of Boiler program, approximately around 10 years. So we tried to measure ours against an equity alternative to Parent Plus. So we tell students, exhaust all your grants, your scholarships. Once you get to a point beyond federal loans and you're starting to look at Parent Plus and then private, we think we can be very competitive.
Oh, wait, so I don't mean to interrupt.
Yep.
So people are also paying off loans and doing an income share?
Well, they could. Yeah, they could. Again,
Do you know what percent are?
This is equity, right? It's an equity option that gives them the ability to really optimize their own personal capital structure. So they now have this tool, which before, right, they've had debt. They've never really had equity to help complement that. So
okay,
Helaine, could I add to it one thing, which was that it's really easy to juxtapose income share agreements versus loans and make this a choice between ISAs and loans, and then you're going to measure the benefits of each. The real benefit to this doesn't even accrue just to the students who take income share agreements. It's not a question of how do you want to pay for college. It's a question of which college will you pick? The one that says pay up front and see what happens, or the one that says pay at least some of this only if it works. And if students can discern that even if every person at Purdue is not getting an income share agreement, Purdue is still eating its own cooking and sharing risk, it signals that that's a better choice for them. And it signals it more clearly than Purdue having to just be the school that makes the best television ads or have the most aggressive boiler room, the schools that advertise on TV at night. People should be able to see that this school invests in its students, even if it's not me. And that's the highest and best value of this to students as a category, even if there's a wide range of how schools are using income share agreements.
Okay, but then another question. I mean, this is a multi-part problem, right? And one of the problems is, and it was mentioned tangentially in the video at the beginning, is that the amount of money owed isn't just about the colleges. It's about the fact that it's actively hurting the economy in many ways. People who have student loans or, I presume, income share share agreements are less likely to buy houses, they have less in retirement savings. So how does that then, for somebody, Tracy, maybe you want to take this on, how does that counter that problem, or does it at all?
So I think the greatest detriment to the economy is actually not these people buying houses or buying cars, but actually American businesses are not getting the talent that they need for their businesses to thrive, for industry to thrive. If you think about the skills gap, that there are almost 7 million unfilled job openings across America, and we have a historically low unemployment rate. Like, these businesses cannot continue to operate like this if these jobs stay unfilled, these job openings stay unfilled. And I think that the income share agreement or federal training programs and the whole kind of workforce apparatus and ecosystem to actually train our citizens, to actually equip them with the skills to thrive in the 21st century economy jobs. Like, we have a massive shortage of solar panel installers. We need people to fix our wind turbines and put in geothermal systems. We need lots of people up and down the nursing ladder, from certified nursing assistants to physician's assistant to, skilled nursing. These jobs aren't going away, and the same for coding. A lot of jobs in IT that actually don't require traditional college degree, skills in web development and user interface and data analytics, et cetera, et cetera. All these jobs that make up the unfilled job openings in America, and there are many pathways to train our people to get there. Now, just to bring in another statistic.
So then you're not concerned about the bigger issue that, say, the New York Fed has been raising, about the fact that regardless of what you're saying, it's just true that these people just simply have less in the way of assets who owe money for their educations.
Well, we want to equip these people with a whole new journey so that they are not saddled by this debt, but actually taking on perhaps income share agreement, perhaps just enrolling in a free public workforce program. Whatever the program is, however they pay for it, the most important thing is making sure that these people are going through a program that delivers outcomes to them, which means sustainable wages to keep themselves and their families with a sustaining life, and we're not talking about that. I mean, and someone brought in the federal government legislation. Just pause for a second. And we have this fictitious divide between education spend and workforce spend, when at the end of the day, most people go to college because they want themselves to get a job. If you just think about Pell Grant spending, it's $30 billion a year going to low-income populations. And if you think about the federal job training program in the Workforce Innovation Act, only $3 billion is going into job training. In fact, if you look at America compared to all the OECD countries, workforce training as a percentage of GDP is at the bottom. Not the lowest, only Mexico is the lowest, and with the second
Does that
the
actually
lowest.
sum up all the private investment, though, in workforce training? Like, if you consider all the employers that today spend gobs of money.
Gobs of money. If you parse out the data where employers are spending money, it is large sums, but it's actually, most of it is in executive coaching. Very few dollars are going to the front line.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the trend, though. Meaning, you can easily look at Amazon and Walmart and others who've realized pretty quickly that the return on upskilling and reskilling their workforce is way better than actually laying off that workforce and hiring new workers to do the future of work. And that's why Amazon and others are putting those training facilities right inside their warehouses, et cetera. And so I think if you summed up all the private sector investment plus the public sector investment in job and workforce development, that number is pretty large. But I think to your core question, Helaine, my opinion is if it doesn't concern us, it should concern us because of there's a couple points I'll make. One is from an individual and a household standpoint, financing their education, regardless, by the way, whether it's debt financing or equity financing. I have a lot of concerns about equity options for something like education. I think they can be very expensive. But regardless, that is increasing as a percentage of that household budget. We are a consumer-driven economy. When an increasing percent of your household budget is going to pay for education, whether again it's paying principal and interest on a loan or whether it's paying a percent of my income to an equity agreement, that is going up, which means that money is not flowing into the economy. It's not flowing into real estate. It's not flowing into consumption. It's not flowing into it's not flowing into having children and buying autos and all those other things. It's like you are now dampening down a large portion of the consumer investment or consumer spend that I think is fundamental to the U.S. economy. So, I think we should be very concerned about the fact of what is the cost fundamentally, back to I think David's three things you need to ask is That will be disrupted at some point. I will say from WGU's standpoint, we're quite happy where we are because we don't think we'll be more disruptor than disrupted. At some point, the ROI on that education is not going to make any sense anymore. For the 4-year bachelor's degree, it's going to go to what Tracy was alluding to earlier. We're going to figure out alternative pathways to getting the great opportunities. They're going to cost less. I'm going to figure out different ways to finance them, and then I'll start getting return. That means that then there's a huge disruption where there's tons of government spending and tons of state budget spending and everything else all of a sudden is going into a wasteland. Example I would bring up to you is one thing that just coming from e-commerce and startups and everything else to me really is fascinating to me to watch is the capital campaigns today that are oversubscribed, that are finishing faster than what they originally anticipated. And I sit there going, is this like investing in malls in the year 2000? Because it seems like gobs of money are going to actually continue to finance something that in fact is not where the future of education to workforce and opportunity is actually going. That is actually going to be subject to disruption at some point simply because the federal government's not going to continue to underwrite that. Individual students are not going to be willing to invest $100,000, $120,000, regardless of whether I use an ISA or a loan to pay for it. There's just no return on that, and institutions can't keep raising the costs at the rate that they have in the past. So we should be concerned, and when that happens, what happens to $1.5 trillion, then $2 trillion? Like, what happens to that huge, debt obligation sitting out there?
Right.
I, as a taxpayer, don't want to be left with the bill.
Right, and those are some of the proposals that are starting to percolate out of Washington. You've been nodding at me, I think you want to say something. So am I right? Or
yeah, what I would say is this is all connected. You had asked the question, hey, what about the Fed study that says student loans is actually putting downward pressure on the ability to buy a home? It's connected to what we've been talking about the whole time. First of all, there's a distribution that's happening. Not everybody with a student debt is struggling. The folks with student debt who are struggling are the ones who went to an institution that cost more, that forced them to take out a loan higher than what their life is able to produce for them to make the ROI equation work. And so what I think we need to do, and we need to think a lot about, is go back to something very simple. And I'll repeat it. If everybody knew what the cost of their education was, 2, if they got a loan, how much a month they'd have to pay back, and 3, what that college and university, and specifically that program in the college and university, tends to provide its graduates in terms of monthly income, a lot of this stuff will be solved. Why? Because some of the organizations, or I should say institutions and schools, who are currently producing toxic assets, literally toxic assets in the US economy, would be forced to either lower the cost of that product, or not exist in market to date. It's a pretty simple and relatively straightforward thing to do. You get people thinking very similar to the way you do, which is, hey, let's allow a full degree costing $16,000 a year as opposed to $80,000 a year. We're setting up people right that way. Oh, by the way, we might want to be more competency-based than we are right now. So frankly, whether you're a Title IV accredited institution or you're a coding boot camp, it's a lot more outcomes-based. And I would argue that if you're a lot more competency-based with your outcomes, you're likely going to place people in strong employment positions that enable them to pay back the debt they've taken on in order to get that job in the first place. And then you don't get the Fed study that comes out, or rather you do get the Fed study that comes out 5, 10, 15, 20 years later that says, hey, that pressure we talked about in 2019 is either starting to dissipate or has been completely eliminated because 1, 2, 3.
Okay. I want to open up to questions, but I want to give you a chance to respond, one of you to respond real quickly.
No, I think it does. I think it goes back to cost accountability, the affordability, and I think the great thing about ISAs, Helaine, to your point about the formation of households and the impact of the economy is, again, when you need help the most, you're going to pay the least with an ISA. So it doesn't have that fixed dollar amount hanging over your head if you're struggling. That risk has been transferred to either the school or investors or so forth. So I think it can help in that respect.
Okay, I think that's a really good point. Okay, so questions. Who wants to go? Oh my goodness. Okay, I saw you first, so you go ahead. I saw you on the last row.
So first of all, I came from the panel on higher ed.
Okay.
And I just want to thank this panel tremendously because this value for money for the student and having that be the core focus of what everyone is angling towards was just ignored, and it is the key question. And then secondly, Tracy, you said something else that has been something I've been grappling with is that not everybody needs college, and how do we as a society convey that appropriately so people don't just basically end up long-term screwed for something they really didn't need. And I think the question I have is how do we appropriately explain to people and to businesses that not everybody actually needs a degree. I come from investment banking, and let's be real, like you get to the bank and they teach you everything about how they want to do it and what you need to do. They basically, you arrive and you say, all the stuff you learned in college, yeah, that's great. College was a filtering exercise for you to get here. None of that stuff you learned is relevant. We're going to teach you how to do it. And then you succeed based on grit and drive and interpersonal skills, things you're not really taught. So how do we explain to businesses where college really is needed, your engineering, and where you need years of science, and where you don't?
It's a great question. I think it's a deeply held American narrative, and I think it'll take quite a bit of time and culture shift to really change that. But I see hope because if you look at other countries, the apprenticeship programs are working in most European countries. Half to 3/4 of students actually go on to gain technical skills. They might still go to college, but it's a technical college. And increasingly, David, you mentioned, emerging models around competency-based learning, these badges and micro-credentialing, these stackable credentialing. People are increasingly rethinking the traditional way that all of us in this room learned. Elite institutions sit there for 4 years, and then most of us in this room actually have a graduate degree, right? Like, it's nuts. And in order for the American economy to thrive, we actually don't need more, JDs and MBAs from these elite institutions, but actually people with real skills that industry requires. So I really think that the proof is going to be in the pudding. I think that the facts stay that if we see in-demand skills going 5 years, 10 years out, and you can actually look at these economic studies, that we are still hovering between 60 and 65% of the American labor force, those jobs, so only requiring middle skills training. That says a lot, right? So, are places like WGU or other places going to tailor their needs to this population? They might come out with an associate's degree, but that's not the point anymore. The degree that you come out is not the point, but rather the set of skills that can set you up to a pathway for economic prosperity.
Can I just jump in on this one? One, I think we can rephrase the point is everyone will need post-secondary education.
Yes.
That post-secondary education will take different forms, and it already is taking different forms. But I also want to be careful that there are certain things that post-secondary education in its structured form still offers that job training does not offer. A couple examples I will give you. One is there's ample evidence that shows that the power skills that we often refer to as soft skills are the most enduring and actually lead to the most lifelong kind of provenant career, if you will. They absolutely are. There absolutely are. They're integrated into most of the curriculum. There's definitely critical reasoning, written and oral communication, interpersonal skills and dynamics, dealing with ambiguity, like all those things. Employers say that I need those things. Guess what? They don't train. They don't train those things. They train skills. So the other dynamic I would say is that what post-secondary education doesn't do well is the skills-based training, because they want to focus more on the, hey, are we creating a great thinker, versus you also have to ready them for their first job. The challenge with the skills is that most of those have a fairly short shelf life, 2 to 7 years. The easiest one to look at is technology. Is like coding languages change so quickly, you have to get reskilled constantly. You're not going to go back to the current model of higher education to go get retrained. Employers are trying to figure out how to do that, but in a competency-based model like WGU is, and the integrated sub-degree credentials and certificates, et cetera, We're figuring that out, so you can both address short shelf life stuff as well as long shelf life. The third thing I would say post-secondary education is really, really good at, particularly among selective institutions, is social capital. The individuals coming through it are getting access to opportunities that they wouldn't get elsewhere. Now, the evidence shows that mostly among selective institutions, that still, again, is affording the top income quartile of households, not the bottom. So we have to get to really what David was poking at, which gets at the heart of the design of traditional higher education, the one we've had since the founding of the U.S., that selectivity somehow is the measure of quality, not the outcomes of the learning. And as that shifts to outcomes, all of a sudden I think you'll start seeing institutions looked at very differently. We have obsessed around our students and graduates' outcomes because we aren't going to have the Harvard brand. We aren't going to have the USC brand. I don't know why you paid to get that USC brand, but regardless, the point is
you
that
have to bring that in, Scott.
Yeah, you have to focus on the outcomes and did the learning lead to opportunity? Can that can be measured? What are the graduate placement rates? What are the engagement rates at work? What are the income gains? Everything else like that. Institutions have never been measured on quality that way, and they will have to be in the future.
I just have to say, as a parent paying a USC tuition bill right now, I take that personally. And I'm getting it on May 1st. Okay, go ahead. You're in front.
As a confession, I'm a private student loan investor. But I'd say the two biggest risks for private loan performance and federal student loan performance are dropouts. So if you look at the federal student loans, 2/3 of the defaulted loans are under $10,000. And those are not people who've gone to school more than a year. So if you could address that, I know you can't perfectly address it, but that's 2/3 of the problem. Maybe it's not the overall affordability problem, but it's the students who actually can't make their payments. And then the second is if you look at typical four-year colleges, and I don't have the exact statistic, but over half, I believe, take 6 years to get through. And so as you go into school in your first year, what you might perceive as a affordable debt-to-income ratio is something that you're going to be off by 50% on by then. So I don't know if you have views on how to address those, but from my perspective, those are the biggest risks if we give a loan to a freshman or a sophomore.
Somebody want to take this? I think it would be actually an interesting question with the income share agreements as well.
Our take here is there are two schools on the panel who are trying to address that. There are hundreds more out of the thousands of post-secondary institutions, and we have to help them take all the students from the ones who won't. And they want to. Purdue and Western Governors are aggressively growing. They're making room for more people. And I think these questions all come back to the institutions, and there are ones who are trying really hard to do this. There will be hundreds of great ones who survive all this. We just hope that they take all the students from the ones who won't. Change.
I have a quick response.
Okay, actually, can I just go ahead because we have like less than 5 minutes. Somebody else? I said over there.
Yeah, I have a quick question. Do you actually believe that student loans are a good idea? That the only thing that seems to have happened is as we've made more money available, tuition prices have increased. And I wonder if you could just address what would happen if we didn't lend money? Wouldn't every institution in the country have to find a way to cut costs to deliver a product that people can afford, whether it's through digital or through other ways? And so I wonder if we just keep perpetuating a huge problem of tuition cost increases by continuing to make credit available.
So that's a great question. Another question is, do we need mortgages to buy homes? Do we need auto financing to buy cars? No. So what I'm getting at is there is a notion of good debt and bad debt, and we shouldn't be having a conversation of throwing the baby out with the bathwater in any topic, let alone this one. And so what I would argue is that what you have in the student market that you don't have in mortgages, that you don't have in auto financing, that you don't have, I think, in any other debt market, is that the federal government drives over 90% of all of the debt. And the rules that the federal government has put in place is any Title IV institution over here just needs to tell me what your total cost of attendance is, which includes tuition, room and board, fees. And I, the federal government, will give you, the student, all of that money for X% interest. Oh, and by the way, there's a 2% origination fee. And by the way, there's a 4% origination fee on Grad Plus and Parent Plus loans.
Okay,
And
before
so you have a situation where the federal government, at 90+% of federal debt, is just taking the word of the college and university, which has no incentive to take control of costs, which has grown at 13% inflation, CAGR, over the last 5 years, to do anything about it. And so what it's doing, it's a system that's producing bad debt, a lot of bad debt alongside good debt, right? Student debt can be prudent debt, we sometimes say internally, but not always. We've got to inform all of the key constituencies to make sure they fully understand what good debt looks like and what bad debt looks like. And so what we do is we funnel people to good debt, and when it doesn't make sense, don't do it. I think we're the only lender in the country that tells people sometimes not to do something that would benefit us. So I think that's the kind of conversation that we should have there.
I think I have time for one more question, but I also want to point out one other difference between mortgage, auto loans, and student debt, which is if you run into financial trouble, you can declare bankruptcy and get help from the courts with the other debt, but not with student loan debt unless you're in severe circumstances. So, which I also believe is part of the issue here. One last question, and I'm going to go with a woman.
I'm going to be provocative. I actually agree with everything that's being said on the panel, but does this approach risk turning a liberal arts degree into a toxic asset?
It's funny, I saw a face over here when I said toxic asset that looked someone like,
no.
You know, it's interesting. Yeah,
absolutely not. You know, there's.
Can I just say one thing, because I mentioned that and you asked the question? If you look at this notion, go back to this notion of good debt and bad debt. If you have institutions that are saddling people with a cost this high and debt like this without outcomes on the other side, then that is in fact a toxic situation. We can be cute about what we call it, and I've never said that before, it came out on the tip, but you could make the argument that when folks are getting themselves into a situation with a cost that is unnecessarily high, and debt that they don't have an opportunity to pay back, that is a toxic situation.
Scott, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, the short answer is no, it does not. The longitudinal evidence of a lifetime earnings potential is those actually have liberal education. Their lifetime earnings is actually better than someone who comes out even with a STEM degree. By that, what I mean is around year 10, guess what happens? Is if you want to have continued growth in your career that also comes with the earnings and everything else, it's tied more to those competencies that come out of a liberal education that comes out of an engineering degree or a math, et cetera. Because it goes back to those power skills. If you look at what every employer says, the top 10 things are all related to liberal education. Now, there is a design problem with most liberal arts degrees. They don't also incorporate those things that get that first opportunity. And so Burning Glass has shown some great data that if you had around 3 or 4 courses to a liberal arts education, those dramatically increase, like literally double the earnings potential of the liberal arts majors, graduates, and it also increases the opportunity like 35% in the number of opportunities. So it doesn't devalue it at all, but you have to be very good in the design of the liberal arts degree itself.
And we offer ISAs to liberal arts, all majors at Purdue, so.
Okay. And I have to wrap. I just got my word. We're done. We're going to get tossed out of here. Everybody, thank you. I know there was a lot more questions, so if the panelists could answer questions privately, that would be great. Okay.
Thank you.